Every company trains its employees, gives them handbooks, teaches them values. But what happens when the employee never sleeps, never forgets, and can be in a million places at once? We're about to find out because AI agents aren't just reading our employee handbooks, they're absorbing our cultures, our biases, our unspoken hierarchies. In Albania, they just appointed an AI minister to fight corruption. Think about it. A country literally put an algorithm in charge of its own ethics. The market cap of companies racing towards AGI only makes sense if they believe that one thing, human labor becomes optional, not augmented, not enhanced, optional. The Excel sheets don't lie. They are not building helpers, they are building replacements. But here's where it gets strange. These agents need something from us that no amount of compute can provide. Taste, that ineffable human quality that knows why one idea resonates and another one falls flat. The thing that separates signal from noise, meaning from data. Duri Chitayat led engineering teams across 30 countries. He's built AI system that scaled to hundreds and thousands of workers. And today he asks the question that changes everything. If agent learns to replicate taste, our judgment, our cultural instinct, what is left that is uniquely human? This answer might determine whether our children will have careers or whether they will become curators in a world run by machines that learn to be more human than we are.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of So What About AI Agents. Today, with me, we have Duri Chitayat, who is a technologist who brings a very unique global perspective to agentic revolution. Duri has spent his career building high-performance engineering teams across Africa, Middle East, Europe, China, as a CTO of Safeguard Global. He led a team of 165 people across 30 countries. And what makes Dory fascinating is that while everyone else focused on automation and cost cutting, he saw AI agents as a way to fundamentally rethink business models and create solutions that simply could not exist before. He was among the first to launch Gen AI products in HR tech back in early 2023. He's been hands-on coding everything, including his own second brain system that provides real-time advisory support during meetings. And today we are going to be exploring the vision of agentic society, where agents aren't just embedded in our tools, but are brought into the fabric of our schools, places, communities, creating cultural feedback loops and reshaping how we live, work, and relate to each other.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here with you. So I couldn't give a better introduction. Thanks for that. I'm Duri Chitayat. I'm based in Austin, Texas, native New Yorker, but I've lived most of my life around the world, engaging in problems that I found exciting. And I think what's interesting about our conversation today is both the practical aspects. I'm not a theoretician. I'm a person that likes to apply this technology to the real world. And some of the things that I've been seeing are quite exciting, while other things are quite concerning. And I just like to be out and engage with folks like yourself to discuss how can we make sure that this has the best possible impact on the world.
Right. And I think when we talk about agentic society and how these agents get integrated into our world, it's really important for people to understand that eventually agents would have to adapt to our culture as well. Because right now people are talking about a lot about ethics, safeguards, but very few are talking about how does this agent like take our company culture? How does this agent become like one of us and act as if they belong to our organization and somebody else's?
Well, so first off, it's important for us to understand there's kind of the base foundation, which many people will argue tilts towards the majority culture that, general English language, the culture that has emerged primarily in the West, that has kind of populated the internet. That's a lot of the data that sits in the foundation for a lot of these technologies. There's a movement today to supply more curated, what they're calling sort of federated AI, this AI that can be trained on a data set from a particular culture or particular country and give it a little bit more alignment at the foundation layer to that culture. And that's something that you can integrate into your systems. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing such heavy investment from governments into supplying this data to the foundation models. That said, very few of us, if you're not working in a lab or you're not working in government, have the opportunity to be able to do that, right? We're not going to be training our own foundation models. So a lot of that is just sort of theoretical to us. Some of the things that we could do in our own companies is first, a lot of these systems are not just straight foundation models. They are combined with our own local expertise, are the information or corpus of data that we use to create the agentic systems. And so if we're very thoughtful about what sort of information that we pack into that corpus, we're much more likely to get alignment with our internal community. The next layer on top of that is, of course, the prompting system, the way in which you apply the instructions to the system to be both effective at achieving whatever outcome you want it to achieve, but also aligning it to maybe the style, the brand, the cautious application of information. So even though it knows it can do something, maybe it should know that it shouldn't. This is often true, to protect yourself from lawsuits. If you have anything like, if you've heard about the AI that promised somebody effectively a warranty on something that didn't exist, that protects the company. Lots of folks are making sure that these applications are not hallucinating things that don't exist, but also figuring out ways in which we can be empathetic to the problems that people have and represent who we want to be. So treating it almost like a member of your staff, giving it an employee handbook, prompting it in those sorts of ways. Those are some of the ways that I've seen folks starting to think this way.
Yeah, I think this is interesting. So really getting it it can role play. So it can role play as an employee. Did you hear in Albania they launched an AI minister that's supposed to help tackle corruption? So they're trying to so it's a new minister it's an AI. So I can imagine you can do a prompt injection and get it to be even more corrupt. But to your point, they are trying to integrate it at the government level in some countries. It's faster than others, but it's interesting at the corporate level, like maybe even more so interesting that this AIs will finally test whether your company has any culture or not, because there is a very big gap between those company lunch-ons where they go and they have lunch together and actual culture. Some companies have it and some don't. So what have you noticed when integrating it AI? What do you see as culture and what scales and what breaks? How do you get people to interact with agents and get them to be like your teammates versus just AI?
It's so fascinating because this is one of the gaps that AI has in general, which is context about your culture. Culture is kind of like the things that you don't say, right? So for instance, when you go into a bar, empty bar, right? Where do you sit down? Probably you sit at the first bar stool or whatever, right? The next person that comes in the bar, they're not with you, they don't know you. If they were to sit directly next to you, right? Totally empty bar, but they just pick the seat right next to you. That's a bit weird. It make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. Nobody ever told you that, right? But everybody does it, right? So that's an example of culture. It is very hard to teach an AI that, right? Because none of that's really written down. You don't tend to write down when you enter into the bar, try to make sure there's an appropriate amount of spacing. Like that's just something that you don't say. So how does an AI even pick up on those sorts of things? Like I was saying before, if you could be very intentional about your prompts, but a lot of this stuff might be even subconscious. So one of the things you could do is maybe even think about reinforcement learning. Your example of the minister in Albania is a good one because it means that it's interacting in the real world with real people doing real normal things. So if it has some sort of reinforcement model, if it has some sort of memory and learning capability, then it's more likely to pick up your culture. But if it doesn't have those sorts of things, it's not operating in the real world with real people, then it's really, and it doesn't have the tools to pick it up the way normal people did.
That's very correct. During our initial conversation, you were talking about like your children and how now they are growing up to be the first AI native generation. I have a kid too, so he'll grow up AI native. So, how do you feel like this will change the perception of a future generation? Because, like, right now we have to deal with Zoomers, for example, and they are very specific, they're very straightforward. When they don't want to do something, they just tell you about it. But now we are having a new generation that's coming up that basically is growing up with this AI assistance, and they're not gonna even know what does a non-AI assisted world look like.
Yeah, I mean, first you have to answer the question of our objective function with our children, right? What is it that we want for them? I want my daughter to be happy. Personally, that's my objective. I want her to be happy. I want her to feel a sense of fulfillment in life. And some of the things that we've seen from studies about what gives people the sense of fulfillment and happiness, you could go back to the autonomy, mastery, and purpose. That's the old work paradigm that says, like, you want them to have the ability to do those things, and people can be much happier. And one of the things I worry about with the kind of transformation of our society using these tools is that we might lose some of those aspects. Take autonomy, for instance, the ability to make decisions for yourself, the ability to control your environment. It might become very difficult because there might be so few things that you physically actually are doing. That might feel quite disempowering. The mass loss of labor. If my daughter graduates college in 20 years, you think I'm going to be, trying to get her into a software engineering job? I don't know if those are going to even exist. So what is she going to feel like a feeling of mastery that she's really great at it? These are things that I'm concerned about. Some of the things that, yeah, I mean, we could talk all day about ways in which we could kind of fix that, but that's like kind of where I start, is that there's a worry that I have with these tools that folks will lose that capability.
Based on the conversations I'm having, eventually the amount of information and the amount of things that this AI will generate will create a lot of need for human in the loop roles, because you will have these very complex orchestrations talking to each other, right? And somebody would have to verify these complex orchestrations and make sure that they are at the scale at which they're going to be working, performing at an adequate way. So there is a potential for a much larger workforce to be born. But the roles that we are going to have are most likely going to be redefined. So the roles that you and I have, the roles that our parents had, they will change. They will not exist, most likely, with the introduction of Agentic. So the question is, which roles will remain available for humans in the long run? And how do we build an education system that will foster children to think and operate in the modalities of those roles?
There's a bunch of places I could pick up there. The first one I'll just point out, we don't need to necessarily debate it, but the paradigm that the future will be human in the loop is questionable. And if you look at the market cap of a lot of these companies that are competing for AGI, the only way that there is a business model in an Excel sheet with a business model that makes any sense of the amount of money that they're investing to be able to make it back is if they compete with human labor across the board. It don't make sense otherwise. You're not going to be selling subscription services on that. The market cap just doesn't make sense. So either we're in a bubble and all these guys at the top of all these leading technology companies are just competing out of ego. It's possible. Or they genuinely think that this is a transformation of work in the future won't see human beings in the loop on so many things. So anyway, we don't need to debate it because I'm not sure I really have the answer to that, but I balk sometimes at the assumption that that will be the case, just because, if we can figure out how to do this stuff, why can't a computer learn to do this stuff? What is it that's fundamentally human that means only we can figure it out.
Then what will be the role of the human? So will the human be reduced to what exactly? What will humans do? In the utopian suggestion that AGI will be the prevalent thing and there will be no humans in the loop, I mean, it almost like implies that humans will eventually have to cease to exist or will have to shift their modality of existence to something else, right? Because there will be too many humans who are not necessary for the economy to run. Then what, like, you're going to be looking into things like agentic economy. Agents will control the money.
Yeah.
And then where does this go?
Yeah, I know it goes into so many crazy places. I get that that's kind of hard for us to. Maybe it's too far for us to really grapple with it ourselves. One of the places where I start is there's this concept called the Haas system. So we can start from where we are today and just try to move forward in a way that is ethical and make sure that we apply ethics to software engineering in a way that we've not really been faced with previously. So this is where I kind of start. I go, okay, there is potential future that's really not good. Don't want to get there, but I have no real way for me personally to act on the thing that's 20 years out. So what can I do today? Let's put in place a few heuristics that make me maybe better at being able to create good for people as opposed to bad. So the first thing, there's a system you might have heard of called the Haas index or the Haas. Okay, so human agency system or scale. And basically it rates types of work on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 being things that you can completely automate without any need for any human intervention ever, don't care. 3 is kind of that middle layer where you want to have equal partnership. And then each 1 is where you want humans augmented by AI, meaning they're primarily driving the value function. They're really controlling it. When I think about what sorts of things I want at H5, it should be things that have high technical feasibility, right? You don't want to be automating things that are just not feasible. Like some people run around trying to do stuff with large language models. It just doesn't make sense sometimes. That's one of the reasons why 95% of projects fail, AI projects fail. It seems to be because people are just not sure what is feasible and they're just trying to figure things out. So do things that are feasible, but also do things that people want help with, that genuinely they have a desire to improve that task. So focus on those H1 tasks. That's kind of like what they call the green zone, the space where you really want to improve. Things that you want to be a little bit more cautious with, more towards that H1, R&D, government, education, these sorts of systems that we feel an obligation to make sure that humans are really participant and applying careful values to and making sure that there isn't some sort of catastrophic outcome. I think applying that Haas scale really helps.
Right. So what are the things that humans will be able to do? Once agents automate the service economy, once they take away all these service-based things, so IT, support, any kind of supply chain.
So I think in certain respects, it's kind of bleak, but here's the optimistic side, which is thinking about it from an economic standpoint. I think that at the base layer, it's kind of like Maslow hierarchy of needs. At the base layer, you need to be able to perform an action, like plug things together, put things together, do work, right? That, for the most part, especially now that we've seen some of the advances in cybernetics and humanoid robots, that layer, I think that's suspect. The next layer up from that is kind of capital allocation. I mean, if you're not Jeff Bezos, I'm not Jeff Bezos, like that's not my layer to really play with. Then the next layer up from that is taste. And this is where people start to talk about like the social intuitive side. Like, oh, I want to have a human that's relatable when I'm getting a diagnosis for cancer, as opposed to just getting a very bleak statement from a computer. But I think actually even more powerful than that is really going to be helping to influence the work. So going back down the stack, I think sort of that kind of emotional side, people talk a lot to it. I don't know if there's 7 billion jobs for that. I don't really know if that doesn't make sense to me, at least. So what does make sense to me, though, is that every company, every product is going to need tastemakers. They're going to need people that really understand the customer and have kind of an instinct that's not necessarily the average, right? And we know that these stochastic systems, they tend to kind of go to the average. So taste is maybe a spot where human beings can still have a very strong niche. Now, how big is that space? I don't know. Probably not enormous, but it's definitely going to be persistent. So that's at least for me. For me, that's where I kind of land at the moment.
So it's almost like agents are cultural, societal, and everything amplifiers. So if we preserve local quirks and we preserve that diversity, we will need more agents or more diverse versions of agents, and there could be potential opportunities for people who are preserving that culture to stay. It's a very interesting. It's very interesting. But now let's shift back to agentic society, right? So not the utopia, not the AGI, but let's focus right now on how can we structure our society? How can we structure educational and workforce to be able to adopt agentic in the most beneficial ways?
Well, firstly, going back to the example of raising my daughter, I think encouraging people to have a bias towards thinking for themselves, to working out problems in person, collaborate with other people. I think this is a very nice balancing act that you're going to need in order to combat cognitive decline. Cognitive decline happens when you offload too much of your thinking to something external. What happens is entropy, and they've done plenty of studies on this. And actually, if you've seen the metrics on how much people are not reading books anymore, not reading any long form articles, they're just kind of doom scrolling some of these social networks. I think that you can already see in our culture, in our kids, kind of a less resiliency that we need. And so one of the things that we need to do is try to augment or balance with just a bias and an emphasis towards trying to do the opposite.
So it's almost like agent free zones or like agent free ghettos where people can get together and live the life without these agents and without this. Well, there are people who purposefully raise their kids without social networks or devices because of this exact belief that it thwarts the person and it makes them dependent on this technology. So what are some of the things that you see in this space? Like, how do you see us protecting ourselves?
In my practical work life, I want to apply a high standard of ethics. I think that this is one way in which I will make sure that I personally make sure I'm doing more good than harm. Ethics to me include things like understanding the impact of the decisions I make on the people that it affects. So, for example, automation is really important. Automation is really great. It means that you can increase the productivity of a system. But if I was the captain of a ship and it had a big sail on it, and in the middle of the ocean, I run into another ship and it has an engine on it, I maybe no longer need all my sailors. But it's a big difference between if I get all the sailors off the ship while in the middle of the ocean versus at port. So thinking about the consequences of my decisions and making sure that those people I impact have positive outcomes is very important to me. And I think that software engineering in general doesn't necessarily teach as much of those sorts of ethics as it perhaps needs to for us to be good stewards of the systems that we're building in the future.
Right. Sort of the cowboys versus ethical builders concept. And why the standards should matter now, because basically if they don't matter now and we don't have this ethics or this things to protect ourselves, there might not be us in 100 years. There might be AI that is using electrical stations that we've built for them to do some agentic work for whatever reason. It's quite a dystopian vision, so to speak. But so what are the ethical frameworks that we should adopt?
Not sure if I have a good answer on that. I think I try to stick to some of the golden rule type ideas, do unto others what you would want done unto yourself. I think that another important ethical constraint is don't be afraid to do in private what you would do, don't do in private what you wouldn't do in public. Meaning, like, as an executive, make sure that your decision making, your analytical process, that you're very comfortable having those conversations out in the open. That if any one of my team members comes to me and asks me, what's high on your mind? I don't want to be in a situation where I have to pretend that something I believe is different than what I actually believe. Try to make sure that I live an authentic and a truthful existence. I think that that's also a good balance, or an ethical bulwark against bad behavior. Another thing is privacy by design. I think as engineers, it sometimes means that we have access to tools that we probably shouldn't use, right? Meaning, like, I could get an advantage by having more information on my customers and doing kind of naughty things with that information, but we should have a restraint on that. And here's a business reason why to do this. I'll come back. This is coming back to practical things. There's always kind of the prisoner dilemma, which is like, great to say, Duri, but if there's an advantage for not doing that, people will do it. So here's the reason not to do that. As information becomes so dense, there's just so many things going on in the world. Things are moving so quickly. What I believe is people will move from what they know to who they trust, because they can't know everything. If I could have a doctor in my pocket with my phone, right? If I could have a doctor in my pocket, which doctor app do I use? I'm not going to know the difference between one cancer diagnosis and another. I'm not a doctor. I'm going to go to the brand that I believe that has my interests at heart. And so if you're an exec, if you're in a position of leadership, your brand, if you're a company, acting ethically is actually a way in which you could secure a long-term future. Moats based on the WYSIWYGs in your application are going to be dust. That stuff does not have long-term moats. What does have a long-term moat? Your brand, the trust that people have with you, the relationship people have with you. That is effectively what will prevent you from being dust along with all the rest of it.
Very true. So now, as a final takeaway of this conversation, how do people prepare for agentic society? What should people do now? So companies should form stronger ethics. We should educate our children and potentially isolate them from it, or at least explain to them that, they cannot be the best friends with AI, because it can turn into something malicious in some ways. I mean, you look at companies like OpenAI, and they are now releasing like parental controls for AI, but this is going to amplify. And how do you, as a parent or as a business leader, feel people should prepare, and what they should prepare for in the next 5 to 10 years?
I always encourage, if you look at the kinds of animals that are very good at surviving in rapidly changing environments, they tend to exhibit a handful of common traits. First, high awareness features, big ears, big eyes, right? They're able to kind of sense what's going on. And so make sure that you develop your sensory awareness. Understand what's going on in the environment. Understand, the latest technology. Listen to podcasts like this, right? Try to be really informed. And be critically minded about what you're hearing too. Try to understand, but then also understand what's behind it and question it. Another thing that you start to see from these folks, these kinds of creatures that work well in these disrupting environments, they're able to be mobile, right? They've got the ability to climb up and climb down. They're not just sitting stationary. They can bend with the wind, whatever the metaphor is. That's a very important thing. So developing a diversity of skill sets, I think, is really important. I think this is the age of the generalist. People that have depth, sure, in one area, but that are capable of really applying it to lots of different areas. I think that that's practical advice for anybody, because it means that you're not closing any doors. It means that whatever door does close, you'll be able to walk through some other one. And so that's that mobility, that diversity of knowledge, I think, is another really important feature. The last thing I would say is also make sure that you're resilient. So you can see, you know, the turtle example though, what thing that they do have is a really hard shell, so that when times are tough, that you're able to protect yourself. And they're able to pull in their arms and their head and not expend too much energy. I think that that's the kind of thing that people should be thoughtful about, so that how they spend their money and spend their time and so forth, that they make sure that they're in a situation where they can weather being out of work for a year. Like lots of people are living hand to mouth. That if they don't have a job, they can't pay rent. I think that that's a recipe for disaster in the future. I think so. Trying to be in a position where you have a little bit of safety, I think, is important.
Well, everybody, this is Duri Chitayat. He's a technologist. Thank you so much for joining the show today, Duri. Really appreciate your insights, and hopefully we get to see you again here in the future.
Likewise. Thanks so much.